Hey everybody, this is June coming to you with our weekly episode of EOS Ignite, our governance study group. We try to do this weekly. I've missed out on the last 2, 3 weeks of this study group session, and but a lot of things are going on with the referendum and things like that. So, hey, how's it going, Max? I'm by myself, but thanks for joining in, Max. Uh, as I was saying, we try to do this weekly. So I'm just trying to be consistent and get the content out for you guys in terms of, just giving the latest updates on voting, governance, constitution, things like that. So yeah, I wanted to cover quickly just what's going on with governance referendum. So just looking at what's out there and what's the latest and what people are voting on. So Max, I don't know if you've been voting on the referendums or uh, any of the referendums or any of the polls. So I was going to share my screen here real quick and see what's going on. Any other questions about if you have any questions about the referendum or polls or any updates? I'm trying to catch up here myself. So let me see. So I'm gonna go first with EOS Authority, just because they have their polls and referendums. So this is so that if you go to EOS Authority, let me make sure that we're on it. You've been voting. Okay, great. So what do you use, Max? I want to know because I have EOS Authority pulled up. I also have EOS X that I'm going to show in a little bit just to see what the format is like. But I'm curious what wallet you use for voting. If you have any suggestions. I was just going to go first, just looking at EOS Authority. So, they have the time left. So I believe there is, how many? Is it 3 months before? Actually, there's probably more than 4. I think maybe it's. I had to. Actually, I don't know. So there's a certain time limit that these referendums have. It might have been 240 days, but it has to maintain a certain yes vote and a certain threshold, which is 15%, over a hundred. Consistently over 30 days, over I think 120-day period, or so something like that. I have to get the details here, so forgive me. So blocks.io so far, but they all look good. So let's pull up blocks.io too. Blocks.io. I just want to compare it. So so let me see. Vote. Block referendums. Okay, great. So let's just go EOS Authority just real quick. They nice format. It's kind of grid-like with cards. Should EOS? These are probably sorted by the most voted. So should EOS tokens be sent to EOS RAM free and EOS RAM EOS.names accounts in the future be allocated to REC? So okay, so people are making money off of RAM and names, and there's a marketplace for that, but the idea is to move it all to the REC system where people can get paid for all the transactions that the names and the RAM fee accrue into those that are participating in the REC system. And in addition to RAM and name revenue, there's also just for a CPU kind of lending market. Rex also helps with that. So anyways, it seems to be the most popular and most voted. So there's 20 million votes. I had to see exactly what the thresholds are. But hey, how's it going, Shaw? Thanks for joining in. It's you, Max, and myself right now. So we're just trying to kind of catch up with the voting here, and just learn what's popular, are, if any of these are going to get passed. 20 million votes seems like we're not there yet. We're not going to get there uh, to pass the vote. But let me double check to see what 15% is. So 15% should be, I would say, what, 150 million votes? Is that correct? Just so if we have a billion plus tokens, it would be 150 million. So yeah, 20 million. We're falling short, and even this is 99% of the people are voting for it. It seems as though uh, yeah, we got 130 more million votes to go, and in 100 days it seems unlikely at this point. This is a decaf, a delete EOS a core arbitration forum. And this is another popular one, but about 20 million voted to remove ECAF. Yet it's probably going to take, it's going to be a challenge to get this done within 99 days. So, but we'll see. What's the other one? Should we burn unused inflation 4% in EOS savings? So, it's accumulating a lot of the inflation that was supposed to be used for a worker proposal system, but so it's accumulating 22 million EOS as of January 11th. So there's no let me read this. So there's no defined use of this fund at this moment. Proposal is to just burn the accumulated funds. Okay. So you can see the details. So you can see as it progresses, at least on EOS Authority, like how many more votes every day that we're getting. So yeah, we got a chart. So you want to see a parabolic, but it doesn't seem like it's getting there. So, but yeah, it's a nice tool. I like votes by size. There's significant amount of no votes. I like the analytics on this. So they, based on kind of this certain size of votes, you see no versus yes to see if it's maybe a kind of some whales voting for something instead of like kind of the broader community. Although, that you can never tell because people can all split up their accounts. And then proxies represent, smaller stakeholders as well. But this is very good. I like the format here. Anyways, any significant referendums that you guys are interested in? I'm also going to just look at just the polls. So I'm going to take out the referendum. And I know EOS Authority also has just polls so that, we can measure the temperature of what people want before even writing up an official referendum, which could take time. So there's one poll that says, should the voting weight be changed to one token, one vote? Right now, that's a hot topic where people are trying to decide where, should one token just have one vote or 30 votes? And it will change kind of the way, there's pros and cons. I don't know, maybe I'm not explaining this well, but I guess if you're able to spread out your votes, or if you have 30 votes, you're obligated to use all 30 votes. And if you want influence, it may encourage cartels where, rather than, if you vote just for yourself, you're not taking advantage of all your votes. And if you're able to vote for a group of people, and maybe even exchange votes, that, you're kind of encouraging cartels just because you're incentivized to use all your votes. So that if you change that to one token, one vote, then it would be more about, having more concentrated votes. So you could, you'll have a greater influence over, individual block producers and voting them in, and it wouldn't encourage maybe as much cartels forming. But then they might have other disadvantages there where, if you have a lot of influence, you'd just be deciding at least, you'll have incredible strength to just make sure that you at least get one of your BPs in. I'm actually preferring the one token, one vote. I did read a Wikipedia about approval voting is when you can select more than one, which is how it's designed right now, where you can vote for 30. So you're kind of approving 30 BPs in this current system. But does that help? Because you're essentially saying I'm okay with 30, and instead of saying I'm very passionate about supporting one BP. So it really spreads the vote. So it's almost like, even if you're not excited about a particular BP, you're still voting for them. And so I actually prefer one token, one vote, because it's really kind of it focuses your support for just one. And if you want to spread votes to others, that's kind of your choice, but you're not kind of forced into supporting multiple BPs that you might not, you might not be that kind of familiar with, but you're just voting just because you need to spread out your votes. So anyways, any thoughts on that? Because I know that was a pretty significant debate in the channels about one token, one vote versus approval voting that we have now. So if anybody, and if anyone wants to join me, and I see more people kind of in our group right now. So if someone wants to join and just discuss this particular issue or anything dealing with the referendum issues, I'd be glad to have you join me. So all you need is a webcam, and I could bring you in. Just let me know on the chat, and I could bring you guys in. But anyways, that was one of the big kind of questions. Do we do one token, one vote or not? And it seems to be, at least from as far as the polls are concerned, 15 million are in favor of one token, one vote. So I'm also in favor of that. So I don't know if they actually have a referendum yet, but this is, again, just a poll. So this is cool. I know what EOS Authority was pushing for, just having a poll so that before we craft a referendum, we can, again, take the temperature and see what kind of support people have. This one has, reduced the number of BPs to 10, and the pay numbers of, I guess, SPs, standby BPs or standby producers to 5. And everyone's against that. So it's kind of cool that there's different polls here and things about Rex. I'll just show you kind of the UI then. Just again, when you go into these polls, it gives you details. I like the graphics. Gives you a lot of details about who's voting and investing a wad. That's Rahman with Investing with a Difference. Check out his YouTube channel. But he's got a significant proxy here. You can see the trends. You can see vote size by different kind of weights of by vote size, and then the number of voters. So this is really good, and you have even comments here, which is great. So anyways, so that's EOS Authority. Let's go to another one I've heard about. It's let's see how their layout is, just to compare. Maybe just looking at it from kind of a software UI perspective. So let me check another. So let's go to EOS X. So EOS X is another block explorer. They have their rankings, I believe, just by number of votes. Current proposals by total voters. By total voters. I assume it means by total votes. Oh, just voters. Okay. Okay. So as long as they do it by number, they don't do it by size, which is interesting. Well, actually, yeah, I don't know how they arrange it. Maybe I'm just missing something, but it says 2,387 voters. Okay, they do that. So it's not necessarily by state, but just by number of voters. And then they just rank it. So these are the same ones that we saw before. Let's just look at the top 3. Should the voting weight be true? Okay, so there is a proposal for one token, one vote. It's not only a poll like we saw in the previous EOS Authority. it says 4 hours remaining, so unless you guys are a whale and can bring this over the top, I don't think this is gonna make it. But it does have strong support, 86%. Let me see if I click on it. Let's click on it and see what kind of details. Okay, so all it does is it shows you kind of the referendum, and that's it. So it doesn't, it just allows you to vote yes or no. So yeah, it doesn't have as much details. So anyways, but it's very simple. So so this is another one. Let's go to the last one. I want to go cover the blocks.io. This is always a popular block explorer. So so let's go to vote and referendum. So let's see how they do it. So same thing. One token, one vote. Something about the REX, something about the inflation that's accumulating, and something about ECAF. And you could see these are the popular ones that let's go this delete ECAF. See, okay, there's some details here with the blocks.io. So they tell you, by top voting accounts, who's supporting what. So Rahman with investing with the difference is supporting removing ECAF, which is, and then we have a lot of other. So Luke proxy, that's he's got a proxy. So but that's pretty much it. Doesn't give too much details beyond that. So my impression is, I think I like the details of EOS Authority. That gives you a little bit more insight and analytics. But this is pretty good, dude. Blocks also has some, and the EOS X is pretty simple. They don't have much analytics. They just let you know what's going on and just kind of display the referendum as is. So. But that's pretty good. Yeah, we just need more people voting. I think that's kind of one of the kind of the conclusions I'm coming to just looking at all the proposals. I do like the polls. The polls are probably a good preliminary step before we go to crafting referendums. I'll have to double check. Let me see. Let me scan through. Again, let's go to blocks.io and see if there's anything interesting. There's nothing about the Constitution so far. I think Justin's working on that. I'll probably try to support, some variation of version 2 or maybe version 2 itself. And then I know there's a lot of other constitutions that do have base layer arbitration that Justin's working to get to be proposed. And I think that proposal, it'll be interesting. I think they're trying to make it so that you could vote for, like, it's a multi-option poll. These are usually yes or no. We'll probably have some multi version, like multiple choice poll for the Constitution vote, and I'll be curious to see which ones get included in that. So, okay, cover the Constitution versus no Constitution. All right, Perry. Yeah, if any of you guys want to just join in on the video, just let me know. I'll invite you. So anybody in the audience that wants to join in here that has a webcam and video audio setup, just let me know, Perry. So I might actually, in EOS Ignite, the governance conference, we had some questions about base layer arbitration versus having no base layer arbitration. I might just actually create a poll today, just on that. Maybe I'll do a little quick video of actually doing that. But but I don't want to kind of stumble through it at this point. And then eventually a referendum, but that's one thing. And then also the constitutions are always a big thing. So right now we don't have one, and it probably is okay because it doesn't seem like we have enough voters right now. We probably have to, increase that by 10 times to get over the 150 million threshold. So, anyways, so I think that's pretty much what I wanted to cover, to see what was going on with the referendums, the polls. Anybody else want to join me? If not, let's anything other interesting topics. What else was there? The one token, one vote. Let's see if we could talk about a few more things, and then we'll try to wrap up pretty quickly here. So one token, one vote, ECAF, burning the inflation rate, or not inflation rate, but burning the accumulated EOS savings account that has about 22 million EOS. Let's see some of the negative ones here. Should the EOS mainnet establish a EOS Commons development program as outlined in this referendum? So that might be the worker proposal, WPF. So it doesn't seem popular at all, which is, people don't seem to be like the worker proposal. So, it's unfortunate for people that were working on it, but it's just that the voters aren't into. I'm assuming this is a worker proposal fund. Any other comments on that? That's kind of a big thing. I can join you. Okay. So Brandon, I'm going to invite you. So, and there is a question here. Okay, cool. So, hey, how's it going?
Good. Let me just plug my headphones in here.
Okay.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, so you're talking about referenda and voting and obviously we're discovering something that we all suspected was going to be the case, in that voters weren't going to be participating in the quantities necessary to push any single referendum over the threshold. So that's the first point. And then the second point is that we're starting to see block producers discuss what their responsibilities are in responding to these, in discussions of whether 15% really does hold them accountable, whether they're responsible to just close their eyes and pull the trigger if the community says that they want something to pass. So all this now is starting to be kind of fleshed out. We do know this is that 15%, it's looking like it's an impossibly hard threshold to get over. The logic behind it was that Block 1 has 10%, so we can't make it less than 10%, or else they control the network. Right. So that was the logic behind saying, look, we need at least 15%. That protects us from Block 1 coming and just controlling every decision that gets made. But then, and now we're starting to see the block producers stand up and say, you know what? Just because something passes doesn't mean we will do it. And just because something doesn't get to the 15%, like Rex, doesn't mean we won't do it. Right. So now they're starting to talk about referenda light than what the Constitution originally kind of expected out of the referendum. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because I do think there are even some, questions about the 15% threshold. I think, so if we're kind of coming from, nothing and trying to create something, like how do you determine? And I think most organizations are actually higher. It's like a quorum is like 50%, right? So we're already starting a little bit on the low side. And so it's kind of interesting how yeah. And what are your thoughts? And one other thing before I forget is that if people want like if we use statistics, we can at least have some sort of support, statistical support, saying that you know, if this were to be if more people were to vote, it's highly likely that, you know, it would be X. So if you have like 99% support, that, and, you know, 1% not, you could use statistics to determine like how likely, if you get more votes, that it's going to pass, right? So there's things like that, which is unusual. I know it's not done in typical organizations, but
well, there's a lot to consider too. Is that hypothetical situation? Let's say we do get up to 15%. Well, then everybody who voted no, let's say we get up to 15% and the yeses are winning, right? Then everybody who voted no suddenly become incentivized to withdraw their vote altogether, because then it pushes it down below 15%. In which
I didn't think of that.
Right? So, so, you know, it's as we get closer to 15%, analyzing what the yes versus no ratio is becomes less meaningful, because more and more no's are incentivized to withdraw their no until the total yes votes get over 15%. Then all those no's flood back in, right? Because
that's true. So you almost have to signal that you're using this statistical method to before, so that they don't do that, so that they know that, hey, their vote is important to have just up front. So, but no, it is interesting that I didn't think of that strategy. And
so the one thing I wanted to, could I share my screen real quick? I want to share just one thing from the, how do I do that here? Oh, I don't have the extension shared.
It's easy to download if you have Chrome.
Yeah. Okay.
It'll just take a minute, but you could feel free to talk or chat while you're doing that.
Okay. I am installing it right now. So what I wanted to share was the ballot craft guide that we put together.
Okay.
One of the last pages, we have a series of suggestions that we feel should be made by the community to help lend a little more meaning to this referenda process. And one of these suggestions was to update the EOS.IO forum contract, the portals that support it, and the Constitution to adopt a voting mechanism that lends a little bit more meaning to questions involved. And the way it would work is that every referendum that we really want to judge should be a 2-question referendum. The first question measures appetite for change, whatever. So like the question being, should the Constitution be changed? Yes, no, or abstain, right? And then if the yes wins, then the second question, which even the people who answered no would answer or would respond to, then it becomes meaningful, right? The second question was, if the EOS Constitution were to change, which options do you prefer? Mark all that apply. So I may not want it to change, but if it did change, I prefer option 2 or no Constitution, right? The current way we have it, or the current way we're doing this, is that if I'm a no vote, then I have no say over which Constitution we actually have. I voted no against it, so I have no say over what actually wins. But if we're able to tie these 2 questions together in using that EOS.IO referendum contract, first question, we measure appetite for change. Second question, we say, okay, if this change actually happens, which of the following options are most palatable? Then we're actually presenting the token holders with an option, or with a meaningful question that there's less room for gaming it there as far as withdrawing those no votes. And so I think that, my point is not so much about the Constitution itself, but more about, if we're going to have a referendum, And even if we're the future, even if the block producers only look at the referendum as a simple finger in the wind polling device, we think that doing this method of presenting the options before us would be of greater value.
So okay. So I have a question about question 1. Should the U.S. Constitution be changed? Right, but that's presuming that you have a legitimate constitution in the first place, is it not?
Sure. So the example I'm giving you isn't like I'm not presenting this example in terms of having an actual conversation about the Constitution and whether the current Constitution should be changed or not. This example is here as how to structure these two-phase questions, right? Maybe it's not EOS. Maybe the question would be should dot savings be distributed to a worker proposal structure? Yes, no, abstain, right? If dot savings were to be distributed, and then question 2 would be, if dot savings were to be distributed to a worker proposal structure, which of the following structures would you be most comfortable with? And then they could pick among different ones. So again, the example in here, yeah, perhaps if we're going to get involved with the Constitution or with a conversation about whether the current Constitution is legitimate or not, that's been hashed out a billion times. And there's no consensus on which side is right. So the purpose of this example isn't to address the constitutional question as much as it is to show a different way that these referenda could be structured if we had the appetite to do to change the code and change the portals a little bit to be able to support this.
Sure. So I think it could it could kind of make things a certain I guess so. Just to clarify though, it does make sense that you get more accurate information if you set up a dual structure like this. But what are the key problems though that you see when you guys came together and say, okay, I want to solve this X problem? What was this problem?
Gameability. Yeah. Gameability is what we addressed here. It really comes down to that the no's can withdraw their votes as it approaches 15%, right? In which case, so we're in a situation that currently as a referendum becomes more and more popular, more and more people are voting on it, it becomes less and less meaningful until the yeses cross 15%. Then the no's would flood back in, and then there may be some meaning to that, to the yes versus no. But as of right now, as the total votes approach 15%, the yes versus no votes mean less and less. And as far as the ratio is concerned.
Yeah, and I do. And I sense that, but I do think though, not everybody thinks as kind of at that next level as maybe you or other people that are more.
No, I think that I know that. Yeah. So I was involved with designing that the workers' proposal fund, or the Commons Development Fund there, or that proposal, and one of the first groups to vote against it was IWAD, right? The proxy IWAD. And when I had voiced my concerns about what I thought was or what I believed was their misunderstanding of what we were presenting, then they responded by withdrawing their votes altogether. And he said, I haven't changed my mind. I just don't want to lend credibility to this proposal. So by withdrawing his votes, he was gaming that side of it by not lending credibility. Right. And so he didn't. Yeah. I mean, I think that people do think at that level. It's not, it's if people are against especially if you're against a change, you're gonna think about, okay, do I vote no or do I not vote at all?
Yeah. So yeah, well, it's interesting to see what extent that
and nothing,
strategic,
Yeah, and nothing against investing with the difference. They're a good proxy. I just I thought that they had. I didn't feel like they were listening to the arguments that we were trying to make about what was actually happening there. And we frame, in my mind, I frame what we presented differently than they do. So I don't want it to come across like I'm bashing one of the major proxies for not voting for a proposal that I put in. I'm not. But I wanted to use it as an example that people do think at that level of, do I even want to lend credibility to this? And I suppose that to some degree, we can't prevent that short of forcing everybody to vote, which, I'm not a fan of either. So.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I do think that there is that. Yeah. But I'm just wondering, like, how major of that is. What's the percent that thinks kind of strategic versus? So I still think it's a good gauge of the strength, right? Maybe not like it's like you lose, maybe you lose 20 or 30 or 40% of like of the accuracy of something, but it generally, I think, is a more of a secondary problem. But I don't know. It's hard to say. It's not hard to say. Sure. It's just a guess on my mind.
Sure. And to a degree too, everybody complains about voter apathy. Is a bad thing, and when you look at the world through democratic lenses in general, yeah, voter apathy would be a bad thing. However, I think about if I'm disgruntled with my government, right? And I don't believe that my vote matters. I don't believe that they're looking out. I believe that it's just a kleptocracy and they're just stealing everything that they can. You know what? I'm not even going to show up to the polls. I'm not, and could you imagine if in the United States we had a presidential election where 2% of the population showed up? Right, that would be a major signal that, okay, this current structure that we have, this doesn't work. It's time for a major change in the way our governance is done. So voter apathy, it's not necessarily, we don't want to artificially force people to vote to avoid the voter apathy. Sometimes voter apathy is a major signal that we need to consider.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. That's a good point. The more you do, or more you have to incentivize people, the less the less signal you get about any particular thing. Because if they're just voting just to vote and because they have to, it's probably not the best approach. One of the things, though, is there's a cost to voting. So I think with Rex, you kind of at least adjust it so that you're not, because if there's a cost to vote, that's all. There's kind of an expense. So I think if you balance it with Rex, I think that would at least make it so that there's not a huge cost, and at least balance it a little bit. I don't know. Maybe it's the same. Maybe maybe it won't overcome like what the original point you were making, but I was always thinking that if there's too much of a cost to vote, and if you incentivize, at least nudge it with a little bit of an incentive, that then you'll get a lot more votes and at least get decent signal too about like what people want. So
I'm really curious to see where things are going to go with the block producers. Taking a little bit more of a leadership role in carrying out some of these more controversial decisions, right? If they're saying, there's a lot of talk that just because something doesn't pass via referendum doesn't mean we're not going to do it. I really look forward to seeing how that plays out. Maybe once block producers start flexing the powers that they have. Now, I'm not arguing the authorities that they have, right? The constitutionalists among us will argue that they don't have certain authorities just because they have power in the code. But if they start flexing some of the powers that they have, maybe some of the voting and will start to change a little bit in terms of you know, in terms of who's voting for which block producers and that sort of thing. DPOS, at the end of the day, the ultimate check is voting for block producers, right? And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's where the voting has to happen, and that the referendum's a good tool, but maybe it's, you know, maybe the Constitution was mistaken. I don't know.
So that's Perry's question, you know, constitution or no constitution. I guess there's some discussion. I didn't really look deeply into that. I know there was a video. I haven't watched it, but so I'm kind of curious about that. But just to your point, if block producers are the ones kind of taking control of the chain, will be interesting. But maybe, yeah, that does cause a reaction for the voters to implement it, or at least for now, like that will at least get them out of their apathy. They're like, okay, hey, you guys shouldn't be doing this. Then maybe they'll try to start voting against like any of the actions. But then again, if it's a very popular action, maybe, you know, they won't get that much pushback, and you know, they'll be able to.
Well, that's to Perry's question. He asked, how does DPOS function without a constitution? I mean, the answer is just fine, right? I mean, DPOS is the individual or token holders select who the block producers are. Does it open the door, or does it turn a blind eye to collusion among block producers? It only turns a blind eye to the degree that the token holders are willing to turn a blind eye, right? Once the token holders are no longer willing to turn a blind eye, then like collusion among block producers matters. But until they're not willing to, or as long as they're willing to turn a blind eye, it doesn't. Yeah, I don't think that a constitution is necessary for DPOS to work. That's not the argument of the Constitution. The argument for the Constitution is, how can we make decisions collectively, right? And that's what constitutions are for, is for us to define the rules and the mechanisms by which we will make collective decisions. And you know, that isn't necessarily, DPOS doesn't limit itself to that world. It limits itself to selecting who is going to be making blocks and getting paid for it.
So yeah, that's a good point. And so if we kind of go towards this idea that, okay, block producers are going to have a lot more control, a lot more power in the system, I think there's dangers in that. But let's assume that we go that direction. So it's going to be a lot more political as well. Like the block producers are going to say, hey, this is what we see as like what the direction we should be going. So you essentially are like, that's going to be part of the voting process, not only block production. They're going to have to really campaign for their vision of it. And the block producers that are, you know, the most popular with their vision might end up getting the most votes. So it'd be interesting, because no block producers are really political these days. Very neutral. It's just like, oh, we're going to do block production and that's it.
Perry followed up, upon what criteria will token holders base their votes on without a constitution? And the answer is their own subjective criteria, right? Their own values, where they want the chain to go. And that'll determine whether they or whether they even want to have a say at all. You know what I mean? It's voter apathy is, with a constitution, is driven by the same, yes, hundreds of simultaneous directions for the chain. Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's what decentralization does. Yeah, it's beautiful anarchy. Yes. Now, that being said, I don't think that a constitutional approach should be abandoned, or a user agreement approach should be abandoned. I think that those arguments for it and trying to find a better way to organize our society should always be looked at. I just don't know that it's necessary for a functioning blockchain. Yeah, and again, the beautiful thing about this being an open source project is that we can always create our own blockchain. We can always start another experiment like Telos did, and like what almost a dozen other chains have done now. So
Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, it's kind of a, yeah. So I agree. The many directions, and then I think there is a trend for side chains, sister chains, and a lot of different implementations, experimentation. So I think that's, and that does decentralize our ecosystem. Um, let's make sure decentralization is a token holder vote distributed among token holders, not hundreds of simultaneous plans. I don't know if you want to respond to that, Brand.
I mean, hundreds of simultaneous interpretations of a constitution versus hundreds of simultaneous plans. At the end of the day, a vote is going to always be subjective. If it were totally objective, then we could codify it. And even if we codified it with code so that individuals weren't voting, even the approach that code takes was a subjective decision. At the end of the day, it's all subjective. At the end of the day, people, if there's a vote to any degree, it is hundreds of simultaneous plans. Your motivation, Perry, for voting is different than my motivation for voting, right? Even with the Constitution, we vote on things differently because we see things differently. We already have hundreds of different plans, with or without a Constitution in play.
Yeah, the one thing I'm concerned with BP power is that the system is not set up. It gives too much power to the block producers, and when we talk about a trust minimization being important for blockchains in general, and EOS is already kind of experimenting with new governance models and things like that. I mean, if the BPs have always had I think too much power, the way the code is designed, right? And especially if with 15 or 21 producers, you can really do anything you want on the system, essentially. And so I think there's a danger there where if you don't, at least in software, limit what the block producers can do, you're vulnerable. And so I would even figure out a way to design the software where you're not so vulnerable to that, and then also rely on the Constitution to I mean, I still think that there's a good approach there where you design a very limited Constitution to let block producers know precisely when they can actually change the software, because the software is not designed to it gives too much power to the block producer right now. Essentially 15 of 21 can do anything on the system they please. So
I tell you right now, I've been studying, and this is the big question that we've got on main act. I've been studying a paper that's it's called Contract Enforceability in Economic Institutions and Early Trade, and it gets into like 10th century traders that were trading across the Mediterranean, and so they're in all these different jurisdictions. There was no one overarching power governing how they or governing or protecting their the interests of the trader. So if there was a contract dispute, who settles this, right? there is no, if we draw the analogy, there is no base layer arbitration in 10th century Mediterranean trade routes. Right. So how can a merchant be sitting in Italy be guaranteed that his contract is going to be honored in Libya on the other side of the Mediterranean? I mean, these are questions that free market systems have answered in the past without a constitution that governs everything. And I think that we need to lean on the past a little bit more. Sometimes in blockchain, we think that we're reinventing the world. And while we have this beautiful new technology that makes information immutable, we're not reinventing we don't necessarily have to reinvent the world. We've tried an experiment with the Constitution. It hasn't totally failed yet, but it does seem like the constitutional approach is starting to dissolve a little bit, or starting to be called into question in terms of its appropriateness. I'm wondering if there's other models out there, if there's other solutions that, even the distant past is solved, that can address some of these questions about how much powers block producers should have. Are there other mechanisms we can set up to ensure that token holders' interests are represented, or the contracts, you know, if it's a contract that we have to actually be on the network through a user agreement, what happens if that contract gets broken? How can I ensure me as a token holder that my interests in that contract are defended? There's a lot to rethink about this, and a constitution may or may not be the right approach altogether. I personally am not convinced that it is. While the U.S. Constitution still exists and it's the oldest constitutional government, there's never been a constitution that exists forever, right? Eventually a constitution breaks down. I mean, France, they go through constitutions like it's like their magazines. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to how to deal with all the breakdowns, especially when, because we use two words. We use the word power of the block producers, and that's tightly affiliated with the code, right? The code gives them powers to do something. What we're arguing with the Constitution is, yeah, you may have that power, but you don't have the authority to do that, or you can only exercise that power under these conditions. But we haven't had a way to enforce that, right? That's the issue, is that the enforcement mechanism isn't there. And I'm not sure that in a DPOS platform we can have that, that can't be challenged by just disobedience.
Yeah, and that's why I was thinking about things in the code where, and I have asked this kind of on multiple occasions, where, let's say, just for that particular point about BP power, is that, you know, they're always doing a lot of software upgrades, right? And everyone has to go to the next version, so everyone has to accept that, right? But if you could embed in software a requirement to have not only, you know, to upgrade the version of the software, it would have to depend on you know, the votes and if you have something where it says, okay, the votes, only if you have the votes, and you know, and then only then can you upgrade to the next version, right? And some software system that I mean,
isn't that already there? I mean, they have to have the vote of they have to have enough votes to be one of the top 21 to begin with, to accept that it's going to be the next version or not.
Well, not of the software. They just get elected as block producers to be able to. They have the power now to, as the 15 or 21 block producers, to do anything. So upgrade software or do anything.
Right.
But,
so my point is, if they didn't have the votes, they wouldn't be in one of those slots.
Well, it would be more about the votes to actually make any particular upgrade to the system. So it's like they can only implement this new, you know, version of the software that is based on a stakeholder vote. You get what I'm saying? So like you have a stakeholder vote, like let's say a referendum. So and you have code. So the block producers will be restricted. Otherwise, you know, they'll be using different software, right? So it's like you have to have this vote, and then you could use the new version of the software with this particular, you know, upgrade of the software.
So any upgrade would have to go through two gates. The first gate would be the token holder vote. The second gate would be the vote of the individual block producer themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what happens because you have to upgrade software. And
I think that some of the trends among the block producers now that I'm seeing is they would say, well, if that were in the code, that would be fine. Right.
Yeah,
but if you try and enforce that outside of the code, and you're not willing to shift who you're voting for, then what's the point?
You know, and I kind of agree with that, because it has to be built in the code. I agree, because you're right. If there's no at which point we have the argument of, if it has to be built in the code, what's the point of the Constitution? Well, the Constitution could just be just at least an explanation of what's in the code. But yeah, maybe we don't need it explicitly.
Yeah, and again, I'm not arguing necessarily that that's the case, right? That we don't need a Constitution. I can be convinced that there is a need for one.
Well, the Constitution would probably identify, like let me see. So if you have this restriction, you have to identify, at least in the code. Well, it'll all be in the code. It'll be embedded in the code. But any changes, though, is based on stakeholders. So like, let's say you want to change like the threshold of what counts as a accepted proposal. So like all those changes would necessarily, at least in the like the current version of the Constitution, would have to be voted on and changed, and then with the upgraded software that would be implemented. So there would be a method where the people who crafted and draft these constitutions would have a say, but that would have to be embedded in the code. It would essentially be embedded in the code. But it's like that with anything. I mean, like if anyone's going to put anything, it's like there are people that have an idea of what's going to be in the code, right? Like so to have a process, because I always thought this was also a big issue, because let's say Rex, right? I like Rex, but it's a significant change on the platform. So there's a lot of support for it, but it was almost like that's a significant change. The stakeholders had no say in this, right? It's just like, and people want it implemented. And I think if Dan Larimer, Block One had their way, it'd just be implemented without any kind of a consensus amongst anybody. But then to me, I feel like, well, there's like who has the authority to do that, right? And so anyway, so I think there's a way to get the stakeholders to be the prime proposers, like this referendum, but also embedded in code so that you have the stakeholders do the proposing and limiting what the block producers can do to change. Because I have a feeling that the way it's structured right now, it's too easy for block producers to come together and say, hey, we'll have the next version of the software, we all come together, we'll make this change. And that's what happens. And everyone upgrades their software, but it doesn't have to be that way. It could be such that I'm going to use the old existing version of the software until we get the referendum in, and then it's codified. It's all kind of it's embedded in the system so that this is like, once it's accepted, then we can actually go to the next version of the software. I think there's design and software changes that have to be made to make that happen, but I think it's very doable, just theoretically. So.
Yeah. I don't know. I still don't know if thinking about this in terms of a nation state perspective is the right way to look at it. Maybe it is. I just know that when a constitutional democracy breaks down, it breaks down because individuals cease to see value in the Constitution. Nothing changed in the Constitution, right? The Constitution that was working yesterday ceases to work today, and nothing changed in the Constitution. What changed was the individuals no longer saw value in it, right? Or enough of the individuals ceased to see value in it. So this is why nation states spend so much money trying to indoctrinate their population into being one people, right? At least having a founding myth, a founding vision for themselves to lend credibility to this governing document that's there. We don't have that in EOS. We don't have this founding myth. We don't have something that ties us together as a people where we identified that document is going to be the document, enough that individuals who enforce that document are willing to do what it takes to enforce that document on their fellow people.
Yeah, right? and I agree with that.
We have cops that do their job and use physical violence against their fellow people because they believe in the system. Right?
Yeah.
They're not automatons. If all the cops just stopped believing in the governance structure that was there, nothing changed in the governance structure, but the entire thing falls apart.
Yeah, so I think I think those are great points, but I think there's two different ideas of what a constitution in a blockchain should be, and what and maybe we conflate it with nation state constitutions. I think other blockchains actually we should look to their constitution, if they call it a constitution, is really restricted to how do you make decisions on upgrading code. We've gone to the kind of a little bit further out, which I think is still a possibility, but I prefer at the DApp layer, but that's more for like how do citizens kind of interact with each other as a constitution for a country or a people, right? So, but the limited constitution about like how do you make decisions on code upgrades, I think is the first step, and most blockchains are all about that. Like Telos, not Telos, Tezos and Cardano and all, like Decred, like they have governance in there. They call it governance, but which is true, but it's just limited to how do we upgrade code? What kind of features do we put in the code? It's not about like criminal law.
But even then, mm-hmm. It only works because people want it.
That's true. I mean, it has to be supported. It has to be,
If it's not built in the code, and if there's an enforcement arm, then it's an enforcement arm of individuals that are willing to do harm to each other or to prevent each other from doing certain things to the network. And as long as they believe in the vision of that piece of paper that has those rules down, they'll continue to do it. But as soon as they lose the vision, or as soon as they feel, dude, it's not worth it for me to be the bad guy here, as soon as they say it's not worth it for me to be the bad guy, then it doesn't, the constitution that they have, the governance structures that they had didn't change. Nothing changed. It was just their belief in that governance layer is what changed. And then those governance structures would devolve into what we have today.
Yeah, well, so
on mainnet, right, is what I'm saying, is that as soon, even with Telos, as soon as the majority of people that are involved with Telos lose vision in the governance structure that they have, it'll fall apart if it's not in the code.
Yeah, and so there's, but I do think you can embed the basics of that, of DPOS in the code to further strengthen the power of DPOS, versus the structure we have is DPOS in such a way that block producers have too much power. So it's a very limited change.
Is that a structure of DPOS, or was that a structure of the way that the tokens were distributed to begin with? Right.
No,
I mean, we have some pretty serious whales, right? For everybody talks about us being a plutocracy.
Yeah, but it's more about the software than anything else. I think right now,
I mean,
DPOS,
capping your accounts at 40,000, was it 4,000 or 40,000 tokens that Telos?
Oh, you're talking about Telos?
Yeah, Telos. That was a big deal, right? They capped it, and so that impacts the DPOS function of that, not because it's buried in the code, but because that's the way the tokens were distributed to begin with on their chain.
Yeah, so token distribution does have an impact, but I was more going directly whether it's, you have big whales like in EOS or Telos, which is capped, which does have an effect on it. I was just more talking about whatever stakeholder weighted system you have, that DPOS was supposed to be that the stakeholders ultimately have the most power, right? And that regardless, the 51% of stakeholders in Telos or EOS should have power, right? And that's what DPOS was about. But what happened was the software was designed in such a way that delegated too much authority and power to the block producers, so that the stakeholders kind of lost that power. And so,
okay, but you're talking about the software change. You're not talking about on paper governance that's people agreeing to make certain decisions and people enforcing those decisions, right? You're talking about changes to the code itself.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, I agree. It's more.
So even the rules governing how the code is changed are subjected to people believing that those rules are the right rules to follow.
I think it could be. I think there could be an approach that includes, the ability for stakeholders, just like the referendum process is, to drive that process, right? So So right now, instead of the block producers driving the process, right now the block producers they could care less about everybody, and if people are apathetic, they could do anything and tweak the code to favor their own businesses, their own ecosystem. They could do anything, right? And they can actually do things that are malicious to the system. Not that's probably the worst case scenario, right? But it's because the stakeholders software, because the software is designed where the stakeholders lose power compared to what the block producers have. Once we fix that, I think, then you can have the stakeholders drive all the proposals, all the referendums. EOS DAC is a good example.
Yeah, but my point is that that's not governance in terms of voluntary governance at that point. It may have been voluntary to change the code to support that, but at that point, it's the code that is driving that governance. It is not the Constitution that they wrote.
Yeah, I guess. Well, I still think there's still some nuances there, because I think the people drive what they want. And as long as they drive what they want, you could consider that the Constitution. They're the ones that propose these software changes that are subjective to what their desires are. So they propose it and everyone votes. But there is this validation, there's this legitimacy. It's subjective. It could be a feature that 30% don't like, 70% do like, and but it is voted in and then gets implemented by the block producers. But
the enforcement is the code. It's not other people.
Yeah, so maybe that I do believe that code has to be like at least probably maybe 100% of it, but at least the super majority of what we have to rely on, I think. Because otherwise, it is.
The truth is none of us trust each other, right? We have the principle behind blockchain isn't, hey, let's put this together because we trust each other. No, we're doing this because we don't trust each other, right? We don't trust each other with power to tell me I can't do something, right? And this is where I think that that having a constitution to govern a blockchain, there's a little bit of conflict there, because the purpose of a constitution is for us to say, how can we trust each other? The purpose of a blockchain is to say, well, we don't trust each other, so how can we still act in a way so that we don't have to worry about the fact that we don't trust each other, right? I don't trust. Do you trust anybody with your private keys?
Oh yeah, no. Well, maybe a very few people, but I probably trust a few people, but not all like that. Like I wouldn't put everything but I have friends and family I probably trust.
But in principle, that's what we're doing if we have an enforcement arm that is not governed by code. You're trusting somebody with your keys.
Yeah.
Right. So, and it's more for illustrative and I realize it's kind of reductio ad absurdum. I'm taking it to the farthest degree of an analogy, right? But the point is that a constitution assumes we are going to agree to give up some of our powers because we trust each other in this framework, right? A blockchain is, I do not trust you, so I am going to create code that helps me bypass that lack of trust. Okay, I don't trust you. I do trust this code. In a constitution, we don't have trust for each other, right? We just have, in a constitution, we need trust for each other in order for the constitution to work. In a blockchain, that's not the case. So that's what I'm saying is that that core structure, there it ends with each other. And I'm not so sure that it works for a blockchain.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. That's why, I've over time, I've kind of realized kind of the code is law makes sense on the blockchain, and that if we are able to do stuff where we're trying to form some sort of, governance that deals with more, any kind of criminal issues, property rights issues, and things like that, you can experiment with that outside of the code, and you can use a lot of the same systems, the existing systems, or create something new in this virtual space. But it would be different that where everyone would have to kind of accept it, and there'll be like different ways to enforce it. But to me, I feel like the code has to have its own code is law governance, and you could experiment with the other kinds of governance like on top of it, but not have that be the foundation of the blockchain.
Now, I do want to give some attention to Perry. He keeps making statements. Perry, I have been reading everything you've been posting there. You say enforcement is indirect, originating from the token holders and implemented through BPs that survive token holder vote. DPOS vote is the bridge between trustless constitution and a trusted code. Earlier, you said that a constitution is the guide that token holders use. Okay. If that's the case, it's not a constitution, right? It's a belief statement. They're the articles of faith that we use as voters to guide how we're voting, right? A constitution, the purpose of a constitution is for me to take the rights that I already have and temporarily loan them to a party, to another party. It's what we do with constitutions is we take our individual rights, give them to somebody else temporarily. That's different than using it as a document to guide how I'm voting as a statement of principles or as articles of faith or something like that. Now, there is nothing stopping as a matter of fact, I would say that that what the proxies have done more to reflect what you're saying a constitution is than anything else. Proxies list out, this is what I'm using to guide my vote, right? In each and every one of those proxies, for all intents and purposes, has created their own statement of intent when it comes to how they're going to vote. And that is informing, they use that to inform how they vote, and that's their standards. The truth is either you proxy through a proxy or you don't proxy and it's your own vote and you're creating your own statement of belief when it comes to how you're voting. Constitution is not just a statement of belief, right? A constitution is the mechanism by which individuals temporarily loan their rights to the collective, and they give up the power over those rights while the collective wields it. And that is fundamentally different than what the purpose of blockchain is. Now, maybe the balance needs to be there, but it's a big hurdle to overcome because the two approach how people, the two systems, a blockchain and a constitution, approach how people interact based on totally different foundations. One is based on we can come to an agreement and we can trust each other. The other is we can't trust each other, so we're gonna build up these walls of code around us because we don't trust each other.
Yeah, no, and based on your definition of how people lend their power to the collective or group, and if you define that as a constitution, I would agree that there is a conflict between the blockchain and a constitution. I do think there's slightly different types of constitutions or different meanings of it that can accommodate it. But from your definition, I agree with you though. So I agree in essence with that. And I think that's why I feel like, for blockchains, at least for me, I feel like, okay, then if you define it that way, then I think the blockchain, I prefer a blockchain without a constitution in that definition, right? And but yeah, but we'll see. It'll be interesting to see what others just think about this.
The argument has been made that the only real constitution we need is the block producer agreement that they sign. And what that block producer agreement does is it assigns individual rights to the other block producers. Right? It's I'm joining as a block producer, and I give you guys the right to kick me off if I engage in this behavior, or if I fail to do this behavior. I give the rest of these block producers of the top 21 the right to kick me off, and I'm recognizing that.
But is that's still not even enforceable, right? I mean, if they decide like we're ignoring this reg producer agreement, and it's just like,
Well,
then
if 15 block producers kick you off, how can you ignore the reg producer agreement as a block producer? If you're a block producer and you get kicked off the chain,
yeah,
you didn't ignore. You can't ignore the reg producer agreement. You've been kicked off the chain.
Well, that's what I meant. Like, so even if you write in the reg producer, regardless, if you have 15 of the 21 can for any reason just kick anybody out.
Right, but it's recognizing they have the right to. Right. Right now we're saying that they have the power, but they may or may not have the right to do it. They may or may not have the authority. What I'm saying is that individuals who are reg producing could give that authority to each other.
But okay, so I think maybe just a nuance, but I was just, well, like theoretically, if we had no reg producer agreement, 15 out of 21 for whatever reason can kick someone out. Right?
Yeah.
So that's like the code. The code still.
If you're asking me if I want to create law that's as close to like an anarcho-capitalist society as possible, my answer is going to be yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's my point is that the block producers can contract with each other, and then if that contract is violated by anyone, they could try and settle it off chain. Right? Try and bring suit against the 15. It's on chain, the 15 that kicked me off. And if I think that they're in violation of of our contract that we had with each other when I reg produced, then I can attempt to. I have two remedies. I can reach out to everybody off chain and say withdraw your votes, or I could try and take them to court and sue them as individuals. Now, if the contract is decent, the courts probably won't do anything. Probably won't be able to govern anything.
Yeah, and I think it would have to rely on just reaching out to the community and the voters. And it's just the 15 out of 21 controls the chain, and that's just kind of the bottom line.
I would say 7 out of 21 control the chain.
Well, okay, so if you say that, then what can 7 out of 21 do? I thought 7 out of 21 can just
block any change.
They can block any change. Okay, that's true. That's true. They can block any change.
Yep.
They can't implement anything new, but they can block it. Okay, so it was the blocking factor. True. They can stall it into or cripple it. I assume. So those are the things. I mean, so 7 out of 21 is even more vulnerable, right? Like so. I just think the block producers somehow have to have less power in the code. And that has to be, I don't know, that's just my opinion. So otherwise.
That's fine. I think that the block producers, most of the block producers that are making the argument that are active in making the argument that the Constitution isn't working would be willing to say that if it was in the code, we may try and we would try and lobby to have the code changed again, but we would be held accountable to the code, right? All the block producers will admit that they're going to be held accountable to whatever the code is. So I don't think that they're, that side of the argument is settled. If it is in the code, it's in the code. That doesn't conflict with the argument of the Constitution doesn't work. Right. If anything, it supports the argument of, look, the Constitution doesn't work. These enforcement mechanisms have to be in the code. Yeah.
And the interesting thing, though, is when you're an active block producer, though, like this is going back to kind of the thought I had about upgrades of software. Like Bitcoin, they're all soft forks. They try to do everything through a soft fork because then no one with the old software has to change, right? And that's the beauty behind that, where you only, like, the hard forks only happen in emergencies essentially, or never at all, right? Mm-hmm. And that everybody with the software, you have to make everybody change their software for the code for it to be accepted. EOS is the same thing, where if you're in a different version, you got to get everybody to upgrade to your version. But usually there's this consensus out externally that says, I'm going to upgrade to 2.3 or whatever it is, whatever
So
EOS is.
I don't know all the mechanics about the upgrades. I know that when you look at which version of EOS the block producers are running, they're not all running the same version.
Okay, so that there's nuances there too, where okay, if they have different versions now, like unless there's eventually there'll probably be a conflict if one version has Rex and one doesn't, right? Like
I don't understand all the mechanics that are there, but I do know that they're all running different. I'm sorry, there are instances where some of them are running different distros than the most current.
Yeah. Okay. So there, but I think there's a way and a process to make it such that everyone, in order to get an upgrade that the BPs have the power to implement. It's almost that everybody in the ecosystem that is running software has to be in some sort of consensus, and especially the stakeholders, to get to the next version, rather than just saying, okay, hey, we're the active block producer. Let's get together. We're all going to go upgrade it. We're going to tell everybody to upgrade all the devs to upgrade their version, and then get to the latest version. So I think there's these external mechanics that are not talked about that really are relevant in terms of what the block producers allow block producers to keep upgrading versions.
I think that there's one thing though that we can all agree on, and it's kind of what Perry's touching on right now, is that in DPOS, what the votes that you make for your block producers is what matters, right? And we don't have very active voting numbers when it comes to block producers or shifting your current vote for a block producer. And if we were in a situation where 55% of token holders or tokens were being utilized and being voted with, and they were actively voting and actively responding to what's going on chain, then we'd be having a different conversation. But we can try and shift mechanics around all we want, but at some point you have to recognize that this is DPOS or it isn't. And if it is, then individuals voting for who the block producer is matters.
That's true too. Yeah, so it all comes down to the voters, even as this current software exists. So yeah, that's how we shape EOS. Just continue to focus on voters, and their votes for BPs.
And here's the thing too to keep in mind is the happier token holders are, the less inclined they are to make changes or to be activist voters, right? The happier people are with the chain, with its stability, with the block producers able to produce blocks and the chain keep running so that new dApps can be coming online, the happier people are with that, the less voting and the less activist voting we should expect to see.
That's true too. That's another good point. So
in a perfect world where everything was functioning perfectly, I wouldn't expect to see many people voting at all or changing their votes that they currently have in there, because they don't want anything to change. So why change my vote? So that's the other side that we have to ask ourselves: are the whales comfortable with the way things are? Their behavior says yes.
Yeah.
At which point we have to admit DPOS is doing what it was supposed to do.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's giving those with the most tokens the most control to keep things as is.
Yeah, yeah. So that may be it. Maybe it is already kind of resolving. It's still early, but I do think seems to be the trend for sure, at least. So
yeah, maybe. I have taken up so much of your time. Thank you for letting me. I just wanted to say the one thing about the referendum and kind of the best practice that we had suggested there when it comes to a good way to present referenda questions. What I had suggested there, that actually came after we reviewed a bunch of different direct democracy referendum type systems throughout the world that are currently employed. And we read through a whole bunch of the academic literature on what works, what doesn't, why certain things work. And so we settled on that as our opinion of where we should go, is that kind of dual question approach. One question to trigger whether a change should happen or not, and then a second question to judge which change should happen.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, it seems as though, yeah, great job kind of, taken from the past and all the experiences that all others, government systems have used. So,
but as you guys are saying, that even if we had that in play, it wouldn't be a perfect world if there's not rules that are enforced that back up those decisions, right? It's just a poll if there's no enforcement mechanism behind it.
Yeah, that's true. It may just come down to that. The DPOS and the voting and the voters of the BPs are, just by code have all the power. So that's
what I've been saying is enforcement comes down to, there's two things that enforce. Well, there's several things that enforce. There's four things that enforce. Is that code, culture, economics, and this is it's called the New Chicago School by Lawrence Lessig. The fourth one's blanking me now, but it comes down to people and code is where it drills down. And if we don't trust each other enough to be willing to be enforced upon by each other, then a constitution can't stand, right? If there's not something that brings us together to the point that we are willing to let June be the enforcement arm against me, right? If I'm not willing to do that, then a constitution can't work, and we have to depend on the code. I would say that I'm not convinced that there's enough trust for each other in the community for a constitutional approach to work.
Yeah, no,
that doesn't mean that a contract system can't work, right? Like I can absolutely see a situation where an arbitration body emerges, they issue EOS accounts where they are the owners, they hold the owner key of that account. You own the active key. Maybe there's an MSIG on the owner key or something like that that's in play, or on the ownership permission. And now suddenly there's a mechanism of trust that starts to organically emerge that holds us accountable. Perhaps an arbitration body like that would solely focus on accounts that are block production accounts, right, that Reg produce. And then this arbitration body emerges organically within block production, within the block producers themselves, that there's a binding arbitration. You could say that's at the base layer if it just focuses on block producers and the actions that they have. I'm not saying that governance can't emerge, human governance can't emerge organically. I'm just saying that maybe a constitutional approach isn't the way that happens. Maybe it happens via contracts.
Yeah, okay. And then also maybe I agree, and I think that makes sense. And I'm always favoring more, at least these days, the code is law type systems. But even if you had a hybrid, even if you used a contract system, maybe a polycentric governance where it still doesn't have to be at the base layer. It could be kind of even at the DAP layer, you could still have these contract, right? Like it's a very polycentric governance where contracts to whoever you want to contract with kind of start to emerge organically everywhere. I think I think I could see that too. And so, anyways, I just want to pull that up from like what you spoke about in our conference a month ago. So.
Very cool. Which I will be presenting the next version of that in February, on February 25th, I think, with ISDIG, the International Society for the Study of Decentralized Governance. So I've been fleshing those ideas out a little bit more with kind of the rights token that I was talking about before. So
yeah, excited to hear updates on that. So yeah, that was incredible. So I gotta get those videos out soon. Now that was one of the really neat, cool ones. So I'll put it out there on our channel. I've just been a little bit busy the last few weeks to get them up, but I'll get them up soon so people can watch that. So
very good. Hey, thank you very much. I do have to run.
Sounds good, Brandon. Hey, thanks for joining us, and hope you come back soon. So,
Yep.
all right, take care. All right, guys, we'll wrap it up. And sorry, went a little bit longer, but it was a great conversation with Brandon. So, anyways, see you guys back next week, and we'll do it again. So, and let us know your thoughts about just Constitution, no Constitution, code is law, BPs, and referendums, polls. Yeah, it just seems as though, I think we're still early, but it seems as though the trend is that people are probably by default just sticking to more, code is law, which is, which might be fine. So just using DPOS. Anyways, thanks, guys. Take care. Have a good one.